At Grand Canyon University, we believe in equal opportunity, and the American dream starts with purpose. Whether your pursuit involves a bachelor's, master's, or doctoral degree, GCU's learning environments are designed for supportive networking and collaboration. With over 330 academic programs, GCU provides a path to help you fulfill your dreams. The pursuit to serve others is yours. Find your purpose at GCU. Private, Christian, affordable. Visit gcu.edu.
Hi, podcast listeners. Welcome to the A World of Difference podcast. We have so many guests on this show making a difference in our lives, making a difference all around the world with the expertise that they bring. And yet so many of you are reaching out to me saying, you want more. It's not enough just what we're putting on these podcast episodes for you. And so I am here to extend a very warm welcome to you to our Difference Maker community, where you can join for as little as $5 a month to get all this extra content. Out the gate, you're going to get 30 plus minisodes of exclusive content not available for the regular podcast listeners, and an exclusive minisode every month. And you'll get exclusive voting power to help us pick podcast topics and more. And that's at our Changers tier. There's 3 different main tiers and then an extra larger tier. But whatever tier that you join at, you will be included in this extra content. And I know that many of you are wanting to go a little bit deeper. And so even though it gets a little wild in there sometimes because of how deep we go, I want you to join us there. This extra content is very special. It means a great deal to me to be a part of this community with you. And I would love to just exchange ideas or perspectives that you have around these different episodes. And that's the place where we do it. So please show up to our Difference Maker community. Give us $5 out of your pocket every month. And I think that you'll have a lot of fun in there because we do. And I would love for you to join us. So go to patreon.com/A World of Difference to join us there. Welcome to the A World of Difference podcast. I'm Lori Adams Brown, and this is a podcast for those who are different and want to make a difference. Welcome to our new Change series, where we're going to be talking about all kinds of changes, big and small, scary and easy. And our first guest on today's show is Hannah Nation, who has edited a book that's just been released with InterVarsity Press. It is called Faithful Disobedience, Writings on Church and State from a Chinese House Church Movement. And some of you may remember in the news a few years ago, Wang Yi, who is a house church leader in China, was arrested and incarcerated after an act of civil disobedience from something he wrote that was a threat to the Chinese government. This book is bringing for the first time to English readers his writing, some of his sermons, and we're getting to see into the theology of many of the house church leaders in China. So whether you're a public theologian, a private theologian, or are interested in intercultural studies and international relations and history, what's unfolding in China, some of it can be now read by English speakers in this book. And Hannah did spend some time in China herself, but we are benefiting from having translators that she's also helped edit this book and put it together. So a little bit about Hannah is that Hannah serves as the Center for House Church Theology's managing director, and she's a graduate of Covenant College and received her Master of Arts in Church History from Commonwealth Theological Seminary as a student of missions and world Christianity. She is very inspired by what's going on in China, this historical movement, and the privilege of witnessing a new chapter in church history unfold across China. She's written for Christianity Today, the Gospel Coalition, Plow, and has edited several books, including this one, Faithful Disobedience, Writings on Church and State from a Chinese House Church Movement. This is going to be a very interesting conversation, whether you're interested in China, whether you're interested in what's going on in countries like this, where there isn't a freedom of religion and there are subversive kind of movements going on at the grassroots level, or whether you're just interested in the politics and the history of how it's unfolding. This conversation today is going to talk about some of the big changes that are happening kind of behind the scenes in China that we're getting to read in English for the very first time. Welcome to today's show, Hannah Nation. Hello, Hannah, and a very warm welcome to the A World of Difference podcast today.
Hi, thank you for having me.
You're welcome. Well, I'm so excited to get into this incredible book that a lot of people have been excited to get their hands on, and I'm excited to have my hands on it as well. It's super exciting to be able to read some of the things that you've helped put together here in Faithful Disobedience, and we're going to get into that in a little bit. But first, I wanted you to tell us a little bit more about yourself there in Pittsburgh, and who is Hannah Nation?
Well, I am from Pittsburgh. I consider myself a Pittsburgh native, although I wasn't born here. But so basically my extended family is all from Pittsburgh, really good Pittsburghers. But my parents were living in Illinois when I was born, and we didn't move here until I was 10. I've lived a lot of different places. I have a hard time keeping track of how many cities, but it's more than 10, close to 20 cities across 3 continents, Europe, North America, and Asia. And that really spans my whole life, from birth on. My dad is an academic, and so they started having kids early, so we kind of went along with him as he followed his career path. But anyways, yeah, Pittsburgh is home. I love Pittsburgh. I currently live here with my husband, Trey, and our 2 kids. We have 2 daughters, Verity, who's 5, and Clemens, who's 3. They are very, very energetic and very, very opinionated, and we have a lot of fun with them. So that's me. I've worked with in ministry with or to China and Chinese communities, really my whole adult life, and that's who I am here in Pittsburgh.
I love it. No, it's always so amazing to meet people who've lived in a lot of other places, because there's always just an instant connection for people who love the diversity and different cultures and languages and just the world. So that's what we're all about here at World of Difference. So obviously we want to get into it with you today, but not only do we want to talk about, books that authors write or thought leaders and kind of what they're bringing to the table, but I think that people's own personal journeys as to what led them to write what they're writing or talk about what they're talking about is always so important to know. So what started your interest in China specifically?
It was honestly kind of a fluke. So maybe not a fluke. It was unexpected. So until my college years, all of my overseas exposure had been across the other ocean in Europe. But I was a freshman, and 2 things happened that coincided and really sparked my interest in China. The first thing was that a bunch of my classmates who were a year ahead of me went and taught English in China for the summer. And they came back and just had a lot of stories and just a lot to share about their experiences. So I was hearing a lot. And then the other thing that happened back home was that my dad had a Chinese grad student who was exploring Christianity and exploring faith and ended up converting and becoming a Christian and being baptized. And just knowing her, interacting with her family was just really eye-opening and really amazing. And so those 2 things were going on in my life. And I was also a history major in undergrad. And so I think I just had, I was always really interested in things that felt big or kind of consequential. And I was really inspired by things that I was hearing about the growth of Christianity across mainland China and what was taking place in the churches there. And so and I wanted to see the Great Wall. That was I was
someone.
definitely a part of it. I definitely was like, I really want to say that I've seen the Great Wall. So I applied to go and teach English myself the next summer. And, it's hard to go, I think, to China for the first time, especially with as limited exposure as I had prior to going, without just being really blown away by both how many people are there and how old the culture is.
Mm-hmm.
And I think I just was really impacted by just what China is and, everything that it kind of represents in our world and in the world's history, and just kind of got hooked. So I came back and didn't really necessarily think I would stay involved for the next 20 years, but here I am. But that's how it started.
Wow. Yeah. Incredible. My daughter, we were living in Singapore, for 10 years, and all three of my kids ended up taking Mandarin as a part of their international school experience in elementary school. But I remember my daughter was the most fascinated with China, just like even in kindergarten. She came back and she's like, Mom, I want to see the Great Wall. And like, China's so amazing and they're so ancient. And then even just little 5-year-olds can have this awe and wonder about, China. And she's to this day still never been. And when COVID clears up more, maybe that'll happen at some point. But yes, having lived in Asia for 20 years, so many people end up being fascinated with China and the Chinese culture. And it's so ancient, like Egypt and China, like their cultures just go way back. And so, there's a lot to take in. There's nothing you could put in one single book that would encompass all of that. But I do really appreciate this book, Faithful Disobedience, and how it does bring in a much needed conversation around what is actually happening. That's hard to, you hear whispers of it. You meet people even in Singapore that have been incarcerated and come out, things like that. And yet this book has done such a good job of helping us understand a little more deeply what is going on in a particular part of what's happening in China. So maybe tell us a little more about what the thesis is of Faithful Disobedience.
Yeah. Well, so the book is a collection of writings from a well-known house church pastor named Wang Yi. And there are writings from other pastors in there as well that he's connected to. But Wang Yi is a really fascinating writer and thinker, and it's possible that people listening to this have heard of him before. He was quite prominent in the news in 2018, in December of 2018, because he was very prominently arrested. It was a very, very large scale operation or kind of conflict showdown between the authorities and his church. And it was widely covered. And part of that had to do with a statement that he had written and released, and it was translated for people all over the world to read. It's called My Declaration of Faithful Disobedience. And really, Wang Yi's main point, I think, that he cares a lot about is essentially this question of what is the church's highest allegiance, or what is the church's highest love, you could say. And how does that influence the way churches interact with their authorities, and not just their governing authorities, but the broader culture around them. And I think even though he's speaking to a Chinese audience most of the time, a lot of what he has to say is very applicable for people all over the world. I think everyone struggles to understand or to know what their ultimate loyalties are. And whether that's in countries with a lot of freedom, or whether that's in countries with a lot of religious restrictions, these are very human problems that, we all have in common. And so when he talks about how, conflicts of church and state are not just these kind of theoretical things, they have to do with our hearts and the idolatries that we face and the temptations that we face. I think there's a lot that people can resonate with and really engage with in his book and with what he's talking about.
Yes, absolutely. I can think of many nations that I come to mind that I've lived in and also haven't lived in, but maybe have traveled in, where this conversation is very, very relevant. Not the least of which is the one we're both sitting in right now.
Yep.
Yeah, exactly. Maybe we'll talk a little more about that in a minute. But I first wanted to just sort of ask, what would you say are the main contributions that this book is making into the scholarly community? Because I know it's deeply theological, and so it's important to note that.
Yeah. Well, the main contribution that it makes is that it really is the first book like this from a Chinese house church writer. The voices of the Chinese house churches have been very hard to access, especially if you don't, read or speak Chinese. For example, all of Wang Yi's writings are available in Chinese online today. If you are able to, if you're literate in Mandarin, you can easily find his writings. But for the rest of the world, for those who don't read Chinese, it has been very hard to really know what the Chinese church, house churches are saying. And so, if you just went on to Amazon or, a library catalog and you typed, house church or house church theology, Chinese house church theology, you might find several books written by academics or by scholars about the churches and about what they're doing, but it'd be very hard to find their actual words and their actual writings. And so this is one of the first books like this where we've been able to translate and publish writings from a very prominent pastor and make them available for a more global audience. And but I think beyond that, I would say his main contribution is, in my opinion, I think one of the main contributions is, this is really writing that comes from a perspective that we haven't really had in the church-state debates so far, in the sense that so much of our church and state theology has been written by Western theologians who come out of the heritage of European Christendom, maybe, American kind of reactions to European Christendom. But this really is an engagement of the whole church and state question from someone who stands pretty far outside of that tradition. He's very influenced by Western political theory and by a lot of, he's read very widely in a lot of both Reformed and Baptist church and state theology. But in terms of his actual cultural situation and the way that he's engaging these things, he's a very different perspective than what you would pick up if you were picking up something that came from a Western author. Part of that's because of who he's writing to. China is, by and large, an atheistic, secular state and culture. And where it's not, it's very much influenced by Eastern religions and Confucian thought. And so, just the kind of the thinking partners, so to say, that he's interacting with are very different. But I think, in my opinion, this is, again, it might seem like this makes it very different from something we can engage with, but I think we have more in common with someone like Wang Yi than we probably would realize, partially because, he lives in a modernized, globalized, urbanized world, not too dissimilar from the cities we live in. He lives in a world where, technology and the digital spaces very much dominate our cultures and our way of thinking. And so even though he's in China, even though it's a different perspective, we probably have more in common than we might think we do. So,
yeah, absolutely. I agree with that. So much of the global cities of the world have so much in common. Even if the governments are different, there's always nuance to every city. Every city feels slightly its own. But the diversity of that, and even in a place like China, it really is so similar. And for somebody to profess faith in Christianity as part of the global church, even though the governments can have different responses, it's so important for us to listen, though, to the voices who, particularly in this situation, have been silenced. And, for reasons of language, translations, and all that. But in addition, just, being incarcerated is definitely its own thing. And so, but I wanted to kind of tap into a little bit of something you alluded to, which is, I guess the question is, what perspective does this work bring to the kind of decolonization conversation that's going on in Christianity? And obviously China has a different experience with colonization, for example, than like India or other places might have. But how does this speak into that?
Yeah, this is something as I was wrapping up the project, was thinking about a lot, because they wanted to make sure that I helped situate his writings. And I found myself thinking, I'm not entirely sure how to situate him in terms of that question, because one of the fascinating things about China, especially the Chinese churches, is that, so much of the debates in the Chinese churches in the early 20th century were around their relationship to the Western churches. Yeah. And such a big part of just the creation of modern Chinese Christianity, whether that is the house churches or whether that's the state churches, was a desire to separate and come out from the authority and the influence of Western missionary movements and Western denominations. And so it's interesting because I think in many ways you could say that, all theologizing in China from the maybe 1950s on, just to kind of come up with a date, has really been somewhat of an internal conversation and less of a conversation with the Western powers in the Western world. And in some ways, this is one of the legacies of the communists coming to power, is that because they did so effectively cut off the churches from outside influence, so much of Chinese theology has been able to really develop on its own and kind of develop without this outside direction. Now, that's not to say they aren't reading other thinkers or, outside thinkers and streams of theology. But one of the really important things to understand with Wang Yi is that he's always speaking to his own government. So much, for example, of post-colonial thought and post-colonial theology has to do with theologians speaking to outside forces that are involved in their country and involved in their society, and outside authorities, whether historical or present. But what makes Wang Yi really interesting is he's speaking to his own authority. He's not speaking to an outside authority. And so there's a lot of what he says that kind of brings to mind themes in a lot of post-colonial theology. but it's different because his kind of the ideas that he's in conflict with are very Chinese. The authorities that he's in conflict with are Chinese, and so I suggest in the closing of the book that probably one of the best ways to think about him is to think of him as a post-colonial theologian, because he's in a different he's in a different generation, so to say, of Chinese theological thinking, where the concern is not so much outside forces and outside influences, but it's internal. It's concerned with internally his own Chinese culture, his Chinese authorities, and their identities. But in connection to that, I think it's really important to state that he's very concerned about the global reality of the church. And so much of what China's authorities, what they feel concerned about with regards to not just Christian religious practice, but any religious practice in China, is affiliation with outside religious organizations or identities, really. And so one of his big reasons for protest or for disobedience is because he's very committed to understanding the global nature of the church, and saying that, a church isn't the true church if it's just a Chinese church and it has no global identity and no ability to connect with the global reality of the kingdom of God.
I really appreciate his perspective on. I want to take just a second to extend a very warm welcome to each of you listening all around the world to join us in our Patreon community. That's where we go a little bit deeper in these episodes, where I drop exclusive episodes with extra content from our interviews. If you stay with us for a certain amount of time, you'll get some merch like stickers, totes, and fun stuff like that. And it's just a place for each of us who want to join into this community and go a little bit deeper. So if that's something you're interested in and you'd like to join us there for a deeper conversation, please check us out at patreon.com/aworldofdifference. Now back to the episode. And I think a culture as ancient as Chinese culture, a nation as large and as powerful as China, and due to the nature of how restrictive the government is on issues such as Christianity itself, it would be very easy to be very insular in one's own interpretation because of just the large beast that it is, right?
Mm-hmm.
So I really appreciate his perspective and the global nature of his heart toward it.
Mm-hmm.
I mean, many of us have probably heard, that we would hear this often in Singapore, that there were often house church believers in China that were showing a lot of concern about what they were seeing in the West and America in particular, and praying for America. And it's moving as a U.S. citizen, even living abroad, that all of the suffering they were going through, that they would be willing to pray for our nation. But I think that sometimes Americans can get shocked as to how they're praying, And sometimes I would hear it's like they're praying, you kind of like we're coddled and we're soft, and that's not helping our Christianity, and it's all true. It can come as a shock to some people, but yes, my experience in the global church is, yes, that is a concern. Having grown up in Venezuela in house churches and among a lot of poverty, having lived in Indonesia under Islamic law, like the experience of Christianity in different contexts such as those does give you great concern for the celebrity pastors and the fog machines, and how that experience can feel so lacking in a certain way. And so, we do appreciate the prayers. Definitely the United States needs them. And I do appreciate that we can pray for one another in different parts of the world, and that he brings that into the conversation. I think it's very important. I would love to know what his perspective is in your opinion, as you've read through his writings, on nationalism and maybe even syncretism as it relates to the struggles the global church works through.
Yeah. Yeah, he has a lot of strong things to say on the topic. And there's a lot to chew on in his writings on nationalism. I mean, the long and short of it is he's very condemning of it. And he essentially believes, as well as I understand, that, nationalism is always at its heart syncretistic, that any time where the church is complicit in something that that does not keep Jesus and Jesus alone as the head of the church, or as on the throne of power in this world, then we're talking about a syncretistic movement, a syncretistic reality. And I think this is where, his ability to talk about nationalism as a matter of the heart is really important. Mm-hmm. And this is not just Wang Yi, this is not unique to him. This is a theme common to other pastors in the house churches. And they're very bold in saying that, and asking kind of rhetorically, who do you love the most? And where is your highest allegiance in this life? And I think they really view things like persecution and, the malignment of the world as a time for us to examine our hearts and to ask ourselves where our allegiances are. I think one of the most powerful things, this is not in the book, but this is from just my work with house church pastors over the years. They frequently talk about times of persecution and, times where they are facing the authorities as opportunities for they themselves to examine their own hearts and to repent themselves of their idols. And I think that is just that is just like a paradigm shifting thought for an American. I think we, from day one, it's just in our DNA to think of times that the world is against us as a time to either lean into defending our rights, or a time to think, gosh, we need to do better to make the world like us. And I think not that we should have a combative role. Wang Yi is crystal clear that we are not to have a combative role with the world, but rather that persecution is a time for us to repent of our own idols, repent of our own sins, and then to see it as an opportunity to share the good news of Jesus with those who are listening to us as they persecute us. They commonly talk about persecution as an apologetic moment. It's a time to testify to who God is and what salvation means when you are being attacked by an enemy. And so there's a lot in the book that has been really helpful for me personally as the topic of nationalism becomes more and more of a big topic in the American church. And I think there's a lot in there for us to consider. I think for most Americans, the idea of persecution is probably the thing that they most fear, or they're most anxious about. And I don't think that we should be cavalier in saying, it doesn't matter if persecution comes. No one should seek persecution. No one should look for it. But there's so much we can learn from brothers and sisters around the world about how do we act when the world is against us, and what do we need to believe in order to endure it? What is it that will make us different from the world if persecution comes? And Wang Yi has so much to say on that topic.
Yes.
So.
Yeah, no, I'm excited. I'm excited for people to read this because it's so, it's boots on the ground. It's somebody who's experiencing it. It's not a theory. It's not somebody in an academic institution who is removed from the reality of what this actually means to walk through. And there's a beauty in that. And being a full-on practitioner at the same time as being a theologian. And also it's very consistent with, what we know from even our experience in Singapore and Indonesia of meeting people from the house church movement in China and, the whole, they'll often call the jail cell their seminary, a chance to learn, to grow. I mean, this was something we saw even in Russia and different things under the USSR as well. And, I think that persecution is such a big conversation. If you're in China, I could imagine, and you're largely, isolated from a Western interpretation of the scriptures, and you're just reading about Acts and the apostles, their posture toward being arrested by their own and people in their own synagogues where they grew up, arresting them, which has to be a whole next level thing for the preaching of the gospel, and their attitude of considering it pure joy. There has to be something else going on. We're recording this, just after having celebrated Dr. King's birthday this past weekend. And a lot of people read the letters from a Birmingham jail every year. I do too. And there's something that can happen in a jail cell where you're asking for the disobedience, the civil disobedience that Dr. King asked for, that, also, Wang Yi is asking for. And I think there's a consistency for people in the global church to read the scripture in its purest form, that really when Jesus got angry, it was at religious people. It was at people who were, it wasn't so much the government, it's like he expected almost that. But it's, finding a common humanity and a softness toward the government at times. And then, really the anger was for the people who should almost know better. Like this is, you're calling yourself a religious person, that you worship God, and yet you're acting very different. So I think noticing where Jesus's anger came out and where it didn't, and his posture, it seems like when I hear what, he's saying, Wang Yi, it's more consistent with that. It also reminds me of, when we were in Indonesia, some of our national partners were arrested under Islamic law for work. They were working in community development projects, but kind of like there's this invisible line. You're not sure quite when you hit it. When you get arrested that you just did. And so, right. But, and they were actually beaten up by a mob, and one of the women had like a major brain injury, weren't sure if she was going to make it. But they spent their time in the jail sharing their faith with people. And that's kind of, you experience these kind of things, and it's beautiful. It's hard, and I don't want to minimize it. But there is a level that people can get to within faith to understand who you're against and who you're not. And I love the consistency of how he's bringing that out. What do you think that we can actually learn from, so he was a part of this early rain congregation that I was reading about as well. What can we learn from his congregation as a community that might be somewhat, I don't know, surprising or different than what a Westerner might expect out of a house church in China? Or do you think there are myths and stereotypes that need to be cleared up that people don't often know about?
Yeah, well, a lot of the house churches in China are much larger than people think. I think generally when we think about house churches, we still kind of have maybe an idea that's closer to their reality from maybe 30 or 40 years ago. Meeting in individual homes, trying to be very secretive, not wanting your neighbors to know you're there. And for sure, there are parts of China where that is still the case. I don't want to say that there's nowhere where that's the reality. But I do think, the house churches had a stretch of relative openness, especially during the early 2000s through up until 2010 or 2018.
Yeah.
Ooh, what year are we in? So, they endured a lot of very harsh persecution from the 1950s, really through the parts of the 1980s. But then kind of from a point in the 1980s up until 2018, there was kind of just this increasing openness and increasing laxness about it. And what resulted was just this huge, massive boom of Christianity across China. And so, in 2018, your very typical house church, probably in a city, a typical house church in a city, may have still met in a private building, private home, but more likely than not, they rented space for themselves. Often that space is an apartment, but the entire apartment is used as a church. Or were even many churches that met in hotel, like conference spaces, or even owned property like Early Rain. And so Early Rain would be on the larger end of the spectrum. They had over 500 people attending weekly. They owned property. They had started multiple different Christian schools. There's just a lot going on. But in 2018, just a new reality began in China. There were new religious regulations that were put into place, and persecution has increased. And so it's rare today to find a congregation as large as Early Rain, because many of them have broken up into smaller congregations. But the varying degrees of openness are still true. And I would say no house churches in China today really are anything like they were back in the 20th century. They desire to be found by their neighbors. They desire to be actively serving in their cities. They want to be the church. They want to be a blessing to their cities. And I think that, maybe kind of one of the takeaways from Early Rain itself, and I think this is, again, helpful as an American to think about, is that, this is a church that, grew to over 500 people, was able to have, sizable property. They started so many different initiatives in terms of Christian education, social engagement, serving, acts of service and mercy, so many different things. And this is a church without any political rights whatsoever. And so I think, one of the big takeaways for me with regards to the Chinese house churches generally is just that, God is not dependent on political rights to grow his church. Do political rights help? Yeah, I think often they do. Are they important? Yeah, I'm not going to go out and, give up what I think is an important part of America and American life. That being said, God doesn't need those things in order to grow his kingdom. His kingdom grows however he wants it to grow. And it is him who will grow it, not our political powers and the rights that they do or don't give us, And I think the Chinese church is just such a huge testimony. It's grown, I'd have to go back and look at the statistic, but it's like a 60-fold growth from the time the communists came to power in 1950 until today. And that's all been done purely by the work of the Holy Spirit and people faithful to evangelism and to the church. It was not done with power. It was not done with political freedom or political rights. it was done because the Holy Spirit has moved. And that should be a huge encouragement to us. Again, I think so many people in America are very afraid right now. And I think fear should not be our response, that we can look to and see what God has done around the world in the face of great opposition. And there's not a need for us to fear because God has done amazing things.
Wow. Yes. Amen. That's the altar call moment. We're going to, it's a great way to end it. I love that that's our conclusion of all of this. I do think so many of us around the world have a lot of admiration for the boldness in the house church in China, and so much to learn. And that question about our heart, like where is our allegiance, is such a relevant one for, any citizen of any country today, especially the one we're sitting in now. And so, yeah, what a great way to end. So how can people find you and this book?
Yeah. You can find me on social media. I'm Hannah Nation online. I think I'm Hannah FS Nation. You can, most importantly, I work for the Center for House Church Theology. I'm our managing director, and we are working diligently to share the voices of the Chinese house churches in the global church community. So you can just go to housechurchtheology.com or just look for House Church Theology on all social media platforms and you can find us. It's really great to get on our newsletter because we always have a lot coming out. We have a lot of more exciting projects coming up. And for the book, you can find it anywhere books are sold. So it's from IVP. You can find it on their website, and you can also find it, of course, on Amazon or Barnes & Noble or anywhere that you buy books.
Well, we will link all of that in the show notes. Thank you so much for being on the show today, Hannah. It's been a real honor.
Thank you for having me.
Such a thought-provoking conversation with Hannah. And I really do hope that you get your hands on this book because it's such an important resource for any of us who are trying to understand what is going on socially, religiously, politically, and just sort of in this grassroots movement of unregistered house churches in China that we hear about and we read about. And we, those of us who don't speak fluent Mandarin now in English can have writings that help us understand from the perspective of these, incredibly brave and passionate and well-read and people who've studied the scriptures and understood them in their own context and are giving us theology that is so rich from the environment of a rapidly growing number of churches, people who are, starting to really engage with the scriptures and their lives are being changed. And I think that whether you are a person of faith or whether you embrace Christianity or Judaism or any other religion, and you have any scriptures that you read or not, whether you're an atheist or agnostic or just, any kind of spirituality, this is definitely the kind of book that helps you understand from the spiritual perspective of people who are living very different than probably most people that are listening to this podcast that are English speakers. And at the same time, it is just really a fascinating movement on just a cultural level, just from a perspective of intercultural studies, just from a perspective of history to see what's happening, understanding even just the political philosophy of how this is changing in a grassroots level, what's happening in China. It's obviously, it deals with some things related to international relations because as, she mentioned in the episode, Wang Yi was incarcerated and that made news in the West. And so there's, political ramifications that this book helps us see. But for the most part, a lot of us English speakers have seen that from a very Western perspective. And this is exciting to just get the perspective of the people themselves that are experiencing it. And that's kind of as we begin this change series, it's exciting to see some people bringing change like this, people willing to give up their freedom to just walk around freely in society and be incarcerated for the kind of change that Wang Yi is hoping to bring in a peaceful way. And also, it changes us when we read the perspective of people who are reading maybe the very same scriptures that we are reading in English or Spanish or French or Indonesian or whatever other language you speak, because I know many of you out there in the world, on the World Difference podcast community, speak multiple languages, and a lot of polyglots out there. But for many of us, reading the scriptures in English or hearing the perspective of what's been going on in China from another language perspective, this is a chance to see something translated, but from their own words, which is a much closer read to what's actually, in their own minds. And I think some of the greatest changes in our world happen when we open our minds to perspectives of other people, hearing as directly from the source as we can. So if you're interested in what's going on in China, this very large nation that has an incredible ancient history and is, a big superpower in the world today, even politically, and even in the West here in the United States, we don't often read or hear news where China's absent. China's still a big player, and even what goes on here politically in the United States. So as we look at this book and as we read it together, I would love to hear. I'm holding it here in my hands right now, and have not read it cover to cover yet, but I've read large parts of it, and it's such a fascinating read. Never really read a perspective like this. It's very exciting to have this kind of book in our hands. I would love to know from you out there as you're reading it and engaging with it, how you're being changed. What kind of changes are coming into your soul, into your perspective? How is your life maybe even changed from what you're reading? This is really a book I think that's going to challenge a lot of us in some really good ways, especially around what she mentioned, some of the conversation about ties between church and state, how expectations in every country is slightly different, and how tied should religion be to the state, and what to do when it isn't in terms of practicing your faith. There's all of those things are up for debate, up for discussion, up for perspectives on theology and politics where we might not all agree, but we can change and bring change together in the world as we hear one another's perspectives, and we might change our own minds. You never know. That's what this change series is all about, all kinds of changes. So really glad to link this book for you in the show notes, Faithful Disobedience. Do check it out for any of you who are Mandarin speakers, and I know many of you are, and many of you have lived in China in the past. And I'd really love to hear your perspective on this book, what you're thinking about it, and if there's any surprises, if it caused you to change your mind on anything. So yes, thank you for making a difference wherever you are. I know that many of you are making huge differences just by loving your neighbors well, by caring and being kind to those around you, and in all types of other ways. So just want to encourage you to keep making a difference wherever you are, to celebrate your own differences and differences of people all around you. And it's through that we bring those differences around the table and make a difference together. And we will talk again next week. Bye, everyone. As we're finishing this episode, if you're thinking, I really wish I could learn more or go a little bit deeper, well, that's what our Difference Maker community is for. I would love to welcome you in to join the rest of us there. Once again, it's only $5 a month to join, the price of a latte at your local coffee shop. You can join at our Changers tier. Difference Makers is a community that really means so much to me. It's very special because each time I have a guest on the show, I record something outside of what we give to just the regular podcast audience, where we go a little bit deeper, and then I post those video episodes in this community and we can discuss them. But also at the very beginning tier, which is our Changers tier of this community, you'll get exclusive voting power and help pick podcast topics that give us, more of what we want from your perspective. You'll have access to exclusive 30 plus mini-sodes that aren't out there for the general public. And you'll get every month an exclusive monthly bonus mini-sode. At our Groundbreakers level, which is $10 a month, you can join and get all of that, but also priority access to submit questions to the podcast. And you'll get an additional 2 exclusive monthly bonus mini-sodes. And at our Trailblazers tier, which is $15 a month, the price of 3 lattes a month, you can get all of that, plus also 3 exclusive monthly bonus minisodes, and a patron shout out. So I would love for you to join us at any of those tiers. It'll help you come into this community, be in the midst of all of us, other difference makers, and we'd love to hear your perspective. I certainly would. It's a place to engage more with me and the audience around what you like, what you're resonating with, and once again, go deeper with each of our guests. So please join us in this membership community. I would love to hear your perspective and love to share this extra content with you. So show up at patreon.com/aworldofdifference.
You know how to book flights and hotels. All you're missing is a tool to plan the travel experiences you'll have once you arrive. That's why you need Viator. Book guided tours, excursions, and more in one place. There are over 300,000 travel experiences to choose from, so you can find something for everyone. And Viator offers free cancellation and 24/7 customer support for worry-free travel. Download the Viator app now and use code Viator10 for 10% off your first booking in the app. Find travel experiences for you. Do more with Viator.